I'm curious how you got quote unquote radicalized.
So I guess for most of my life, I was more like center left, I would say. I think it really, really changed when I went to uni. So, they read about the brainwashing, and that's really where I learned about discovered about Foucault and all those philosophers who worked a lot on like power dynamics, all those things.
The postmodern neo-Marxists, postmodern neo-Marxist propaganda.
Yeah, that's when it happened. I had a phase where I was more like, oh yeah, I feel like align more with anarchism, and then a phase where I was like, oh no, I align more with communism. Oh no, now it's more like anarcho-communism. So it's like, I don't like to label myself as with a specific ideology or whatever. I just know my values, and yeah, I guess I'm flexible again, like as we said earlier, depending on the context. If it's electoral context, then, I'm not going to be some sort of Puritan and be like, no, like mainstream politics are useless, they don't matter. What we need is like a true revolution. No, I'm definitely going to converse and do the work and stuff. But then like when it's not election time, like I might be a bit more abstract, a bit more philosophical. And so, yeah. What about you?
I also don't label myself. I'd recommend that. It's good that you don't label yourself, because people who do get pigeonholed, they get a certain audience who expects them to adhere to a ideological dogma, and then when they don't adhere to it, they're canceled from the in-group. And, truthfully, like a lot of these like so-called divisions with anarchists and Marxists on the LeftTube sphere, a lot of people are looking for easy answers, like to complex new problems, and they're looking to old solutions.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Alice Cappelle, a French video essayist who has now written a book called Collapse Feminism. But today we're going to be talking about the French elections that happened a couple of months ago. And a lot of us want to know what the hell happened in these French elections. And because it seemed like something to hope for, right? There was a lot of cause for hope. The left won a surprise victory, all for Emmanuel Macron to be like, nope, we're going to appoint a far-right government. And a lot of us are here thinking, outside of France, what's going on? And France is an extremely insular culture, as I'm sure you're aware of. But you have a video on the French elections, which was really good at explaining what happened, the basic gist of what went down. And you, of course, canvassed for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And I have a bunch of different questions for myself and on behalf of the audience about, the parties and the situation. But, before getting straight into it, would you like to introduce yourself, anything I missed? And also, what you were up to during the French elections, because, you were active, a participant.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. So, yeah, my name is Alice Cappelle. I'd like to call myself, oh my gosh, there's so many titles. I always struggle to introduce myself. I guess like video essayist, YouTuber, video journalist, like all those titles, they work for me. And yes, as you said, I was involved during the French elections, both online and in real life. So canvassing for different candidates, as you probably already know, like the left during those elections, they built a coalition, which means that you had different parties under the left wing, the New Popular Front label. You had the Greens, you had the more like center-left party, called Le PS. Then you had obviously like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, so that's the more radical left party. And then am I forgetting someone? Of course, the Communist Party. So these was like the main parties involved under that coalition, the New Popular Front. So personally, I did canvass for a Green candidate, and who was the other one? Two green candidates actually. But yeah, that was part of like the job. So what we decided to do, we decided to form that Republican front, as we called it. So we accepted to, put our differences to the side, just work collectively on making sure that the far right doesn't win the election. And it was very successful, I want to say. But as you rightly mentioned, the government, Macron, our president, did not really, do what was expected, which in our republic, what is expected is that the biggest group in parliament get to select their prime minister. That did not happen. Macron used the excuse. I mean, I guess we'll get more into details. I feel like I'm just like rolling out the scripts because I've been telling this story like so many times and it's such a source of frustration. But I'll say that I'm glad that we're touching on this topic now, like months after it happened, because there are still things happening. Even like a couple of days ago, a new sort of little turn, a new event happened. So things might change again. So I'm glad that we're covering this now after a few months. So yeah.
I guess maybe to give some context leading up to, what the hell happened, right, is everyone thought the far right was going to win because they won the first round of elections, right, the legislative elections. And leading up to it, correct me if I'm wrong, the center and the left sort of formed a pact in which they decided to drop out of races in which, the one party, if they're second place, they would drop out so not to steal votes from the other party, which would make it easier to not divide the vote and have the right win. And kind of doing that sort of last minute allowed them to kind of get a surprise victory. But I guess it was a surprise only because Macron, his party, which I believe is, it's like a center-right neoliberal party. I forget the name.
Yeah. Renaissance. La République en Marche, like that was the initial name of the party. So like the Republic, not marching, but like moving forward. That was kind of like the idea. And then they changed to Renaissance, so rebirth. That's kind of like the idea.
Right. So a pact between them, and he didn't get the result he wanted, or did he? I don't know. I have some questions about that. I'm not sure. But yeah, I guess they got more seats, but didn't the far right win the popular vote by a lot? It seems like it just the data.
They won the popular vote, but at the same time, like, because that obviously they used that argument after the election. They said, well, we might have lost in terms of like how many seats we have, but we won the popular vote. We got the most votes. But you have to take into account that, as you rightly said, some candidates removed themselves from the race to prioritize the Republican candidate. And by Republican candidate, we don't mean like right wing. We mean like the candidate that was part of what we call the Republican Front, le Front Républicain. So it's this coalition of parties from the left to the right, not the far right. So it's this idea of like, we can have a republic. Those parties believe in Republican values, not the far right. So we don't do coalitions with the far right, and we do everything we can to keep the far right out of government. That's what happened after the first round of the election, when we saw that the far right was going to win and that they would probably get to select their prime minister. At that time, the New Popular Front, Republican Front, like two different things. The New Popular Front is the left-wing coalition. They had already formed themselves before that first round, so that even though they didn't, the results were kind of scary after the first round, like we had been doing the work in the background. The goal for that week before the second round was to get as many Republican candidates as possible out of the race so that we could favor the Republican candidate that had the most votes. I know it's a bit technical, but basically the idea was we're going to move all our votes towards that one candidate. They can be left-wing, they can be right-wing, but we want everything but the far right. That was kind of like the general idea for that second round.
So before getting into why exactly, Macron did not seem to really, I guess, respect these results and didn't appoint a prime minister of the left, because, of course, this might seem confusing to both Americans and Canadians, Canada, where I'm based on. It seems like you have a France has a mixture of the two systems in some regard, where it has a parliament and a prime minister, as well as a president who's sort of like the head of state, an elected monarch, some might say. And they guess they have to ultimately give the cosign as to who is the prime minister. But the composition of this coalition, you did outline the different parties briefly, with like the Greens, the communists, the socialists, and Mélenchon's party. I forget what it's called also, but it's not the Socialist Party. It's a more left wing party.
Yeah.
What's it called again?
In French, it's La France Insoumise. So you would translate it as France Unbowed, I would guess. Yeah. But it's a more,
That makes sense.
yeah, it's like, you have center left, and then that would be the left wing party. It's not like crazy radical. It is presented as like super radical in the media. But when you look at the program, there's nothing like truly revolutionary. It's still like pro-capitalism, like it won't change the structure of the state too much. There is this idea of like the Sixth Republic. We're currently in France in the Fifth Republic. And as you said, like in the Fifth Republic, one very big feature of that is that the president has a lot of power. The president can do a lot of things, like, for example, select the prime minister, even though the leading party in parliament is not the right, that sort of thing. That's totally possible under the Fifth Republic. So the idea of the Sixth Republic, which has been pushed by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is something way more democratic, where the parliament has a lot more power. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious some of Mélenchon's policies, because of course he was the sort of front man of this coalition that got most of the media spotlight, it seems. And just from a quick glance, it did seem to me like his program seemed almost less radical than even Jeremy Corbyn's. But I'm curious exactly, some of his ideas, and if you think that it would have been possible for the coalition, if it were to govern, agree on these policies, because of course there's people further to the left, but also I don't know much about the Greens in France, but just on the impression of Greens in Germany and Greens in Canada, the Greens tend to be, the weak link of the left. Some might say they're very, very moderate, extremely moderate. But yeah, curious.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things to cover. I guess I'll start with the Greens. It's interesting. Yeah, the more I learn about the different Green parties in Europe, the more I'm like, I guess the Green Party in France has changed quite a bit recently, and it has changed in a good way, where it goes in the direction of what the Green Party would be in the UK, where they embodied that like pro-Palestinian voice, a bit more radical, and a lot of people actually voted for the Green Party instead of Labour. In France, like you can tell, like there's that accountability where younger Green members, Green Party members, are kind of pushing the party towards anti-capitalism, etc. So I wouldn't say it's as like in Germany or in Ireland, for example, where the Greens are like, it's like plant more trees and invest more into like public transports, and that's it. So I guess, yeah, it's kind of different on that level. But yeah, the program of Mélenchon was not too radical. And you know what? It was very funny for me to see that after the elections, Jean-Luc Mélenchon was put on a lot of like articles and everything in the international press, whereas in France, like in the past, like the previous month, like he had been presented as the devil. In France, we say that over the 10 years, we went from Marine Le Pen, so the far right, being presented as the devil, and now being more and more normalized. And on the other hand, Mélenchon, who was seen as like, that more radical left-wing person, but the same way Corbyn would be a more radical left-wing person, slowly be demonized by mainstream media, etc. So there has been that shift. And I think that's also why a lot of people saw Mélenchon and his party as like some sort of like super radical anti-establishment, but like to a level where people wouldn't feel comfortable type of party. When in fact, like if you look at the program, like point by point, it was okay. Like it was not a revolution. It was a left-wing program, that's for sure. And we can debate about like how much they could have done in parliament, because, even if they got the most seats, they didn't have like a majority. They already built that left-wing majority within that coalition. So I think that's also one of the reasons why, but I guess we'll talk about that later. One of the reasons why Macron felt legitimate to not nominate a left-wing prime minister, because technically, like if the far right and the right also did a coalition, they would be the leading party in parliament. So yeah, so that's where like the gray area is, I would say. But I guess it was more about the symbolism at that point of winning, having the left win, especially in that climate, especially in that context. As I described earlier, with that shift from the left being perceived as a government party to now like, oh yeah, the left is full of Islamo-leftists. They have like that sort of weird relationship with Islam and they are anti-republic. And now like the far right is presented as like a party we can govern with, that we can vote with. So the Republican front I mentioned earlier, which was such a big feature of the Fifth Republic, especially after what happened during the Second World War, it's kind of like disappearing progressively. We're lucky that it still existed for that elections. But yeah, we can see that more and more. The same way, it's pretty much the same thing as in Europe. Like you see the right starting to vote text with the far right, which is something they wouldn't do in the past because you had this idea of like the cordon sanitaire. Just you don't do anything with the far right. It's just, even if you agree with them on a specific text or whatever, you just don't recognize them as a legitimate democratic party. It's just out of the equation. And that sort of thing is kind of like disappearing progressively.
A lot of questions there. I mean, off the bat, since you brought it up, was that the rationale that Macron gave for not accepting the results, that the left just wouldn't be able to govern? I'm curious what his rationale he gave to the public, because you need to have some basis of legitimacy if you're not going to accept an election, right?
Well, to be honest with you, like when he spoke after the election, it felt like a bit of a post-truth moment because everyone was saying, oh yeah, the left has won, because technically they did. They won the most seats in parliament. And you had Macron coming on TV and saying, no, no one has won. So it's a bit of it created a lot of anger, actually, like a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, frustration, because of all the work that had been put in that election, especially on the left-wing side of things, because we were starting in a really, really bad position. Just to bring back some context here, Macron dissolved the assembly right after the European elections when the far right scored, like, they came out first during those European elections. And then he called these snap elections, which a lot of people didn't understand what was going on. Like, why would you dissolve the parliament when Marine Le Pen is the strongest, when the far right is the strongest? Like, what is it? What are you trying to do? Then the elections happened. We kind of changed what was supposed to happen. Like the left won, which is, honestly, it was crazy. Like people were like going crazy. Like, how did we do it? Yes, we did it. And then, as you said, like Macron ended up saying, nope, no one won. And after a few weeks, he nominated, I wouldn't say far-right prime minister, because like he identifies, I think, as the equivalent of like the Republicans or conservative. But when you look at the government that he set up and the people working with him, yeah, it has that sort of far-right undertones, with strongly anti-immigration, strongly conservative, people who were part into the mariage pour tous movement, which was a movement that was against gay marriage. Like, this is what we're working with.
That is very surprising, because I saw you had a video about how the far right becoming more pro-gay, right? And the far right in America and Canada is more reactionary in terms of like the trans issues, but I didn't know that the far right in France, they're that far, they're opposed to gay marriage.
Yeah, I mean, like Marine Le Pen in particular, she doesn't like people to remind her of her position on gay marriage. When there were discussions about like making it legal, she was strongly opposed to it because at the time her party was embracing its conservatism. Now it has this sort of different type of vibe that something that is happening, like not just in France. You see it in the Netherlands, you see it in more and more countries where they're not as conservative, or they don't present as conservatives on the social things, but they're very careful with, they pick and choose. So they'll say, no, we're going to protect the women. We're going to protect the women by tackling immigration. We're going to protect gay people by tackling immigration. We're going to get rid of all those toxic ideologies that might threaten your existence. In the Netherlands, you have the same rhetoric. And yeah, like the far right in France is one of the parties with the most gay men. Like, it's actually quite surprising. And it's not only that there are a certain amount of gay men, but it's also like they are coming out, like they are open about their sexuality. And in that video that I've made, I share this anecdote of this journalist who did some research in people who identified as gay or queer in politics. And she had no difficulty to find those people in more left-wing progressive parties. She had a lot of difficulty to find people who were willing to open up about their sexuality on the right side of the spectrum, except for the variety, except for Marine Le Pen, for her party, where people were quite open about their sexuality. And it's well known. Like a lot of the executive, the people like in power in the party are gay. And I remember like when her dad, the founder of the National, which is now the Rassemblement
Right.
National, National Rally, the father was extremely opposed to all of this, like super conservative, made some really, really bad comments about gay people. And now like she's rebranding, into some sort of like more, well, I don't even know how to describe it really. Sometimes I use the expression pastel progressivism, but I feel like with her, it's even different, it's something kind of different.
Homo-fascist.
Sorry? Yeah,
Homo-fascist.
homo nationalism actually
Well,
is the word. Like I was just reminded of
well,
it. Yeah, homo
I was
nationalism.
going to ask actually if like are they really fascist? Because I heard conflicting things. Like is Marie Le Pen a fascist? I see it more in her father from what I've seen. Like her father seemed closer to it. But I mean like when I say like are they fascist, what I mean is do they see a vision of France that has a very exclusive idea of like who the people are and who are not, as well as like a collectivist pseudo socialist? Because when I see, for me, like it's something's fascist when I see it trying to be a little socialistic while being like pretty racist. When I see the pseudo socialism, I'm like, oh boy, yeah, that's when we're getting in fascist territory. But I'm curious, yeah, because people say Trump's a fascist. I don't really see it. I think there's aspects of MAGA that are, but I think Trump's just kind of like a more far right neoliberal. But yeah,
No, it's interesting. And I guess like there are many different definitions of what fascism is. And like some people will say, yeah, she is because of this, that. Other people will say, no, she's not because of this, that. And it's hard to know because you can definitely see like two trends within the party. One trend is more like the sort of what I would call the Meloni trend, where when you look at Meloni, so Italy's prime minister, she's definitely trying to appear as a sort of neoliberal icon, trying to gain momentum, gain power in Europe, like to a level where it's kind of getting concerning. Like you can see that how she's getting closer to the people in power in Europe and how she's trying to appear as respectable as possible. So you have that side, that trend, I would say. And then you have the more like low-key national socialism type of thing where, like she's embracing more social stuff, whether it's like retirement, for example, like they were opposed to the retirement reform. Now, like even more recently, like the current government is trying to pass a new, like to completely change the way we run our like NHS, let's say, and they're opposed to it. And actually, like that's the breaking news. Like this has just recently happened where they will vote potentially with the left to remove the current government. So you see, like this is still ongoing. Like this is not over. Like this is still happening. So you can see like some patterns of like, no, we're social, like we've become this social movement. But at the same time, like a lot of it disappeared when they were very close to winning the election, because there's also that awareness that you need to be pro-business. So you need to have the support of business. And if you don't have that, we will never be elected. So all the like more social reforms kind of disappeared in the last few weeks. So when they were asked on TV about like, oh, so are you going to like remove the reform on retirement? Are you going to do all this thing? The closer we got to the very last moments of the election, the closer they were like, maybe first we'll check like the finances and stuff. So like they went back to the more like neoliberal aspect of things. It's hard to know really. Like they're kind of bouncing between those two trends, I would say.
so were they socially right wing, economically a little left wing before leading up to the election? Is that how they presented themselves anyway?
They really presented themselves as like a receptacle for all the anti-establishment skepticism, the same way that Trump did that. It's like, we are now the party of the skeptics, and there is healthy skepticism, there is conspiracy theory type of skepticism, but deep down, like I feel like skepticism is very much about like the anti-establishment, and it has this sort of anti-elitist aspect to it. So she very much like went on that trend of we are anti-establishment, we are anti-elite, And in that sense, that's how she drew the attention to working class voters, people who used to vote for the left, or people who were close to the Communist Party even, switched to Marine Le Pen because of that
Really?
anti-establishment element. Oh yeah, like where I come
Interesting.
from, I grew up in the north of France, where my mom in particular, like she grew up in the former mining sites, and you had a very strong like communist culture. But it's interesting because like people didn't read like Marx or Lenin or all those things. It was just like communism was a way of life, or communism was socialism, and the people in the councils, etc., over there were all like socialists. And if you look at this area of France, which for me is probably the most interesting when you want to learn more about like the far right rise in France, those socialist or communist representatives who were in the north of France, they had been there for like decades. And when Marine Le Pen tried to gain momentum to be elected, to win more and more constituencies, that's where she went, because she knew that people had a little bit of resentment, and obviously there was a little bit of corruption as well. Like, that's what happens when people stay in the same positions for long periods of time. So they kind of played on that, where they embodied a new form of anti-establishments against those communists and socialists who've been around corrupting, doing their little business for decades. We're going to change that. We're going to embody the new anti-establishment in that area. That's where they started. That's where they experimented. And then they kind of grew from there. But yeah, the north of France, the former mining sites, have really been a place for experimentation for Marine Le Pen back in like mid to 2010s. And then she grew from there. Yeah. With that sort of socialists, that's why I mean, like this was more like the socialist with massive quotation arc of Marine Le Pen. And she knew that in the South, on the other hand, she had that more very like racist, more neoliberal, like the people who were probably involved during the Second World War with the Nazis and stuff. So like that sort of neo-Nazi aspects side of the far right is more like in the south of France. In the north of France, it was way more communist, socialist, and better. So that's how like she kind of has like this, the south and the north, they vote for Marine Le Pen, but for very different reasons.
Supporters?
Sorry?
Like Vichy supporters?
Yeah, like neo-Nazis, like all the like the pro-monarchy groups and stuff like that. Some of them are also close to Paris, but yeah, it's very known that in the south of France, it's more the richer, the rich sort of like, like neo-Nazis, bourgeoisie type of, So you have those two sides, and she's trying to balance those two sides. So yeah.
Interesting.
Mm.
That is really interesting, because Donald Trump and Vance won the working class vote. Like they got more working class supporters than the Democrats did this time around by a larger margin than they did before. That being said, a majority of, or at least a large portion of the working class doesn't actually even vote at all in the United States. I'm curious if in France, in this election, Marine Le Pen and their national rally won the majority of working class voters, or if a lot of working class people in France don't vote, because you would think that the socialists, right, the left, was traditionally representatives of the working class. I'm curious if that has changed a lot, if the left has been able to pick back up support of working class, or if the far right's still pretty dominant there.
To be honest, like what we see in France is very, very similar to what is happening in the US in terms of like how the working class vote is moving from the left to the right, the white working class votes especially. But things are changing, as we saw in the elections, where it's not just white working classes. In France, we don't see it as much, but I feel like it's something that's going to happen in the future. So yeah, it's a big source of frustration on the left, a big source of debate as well within different left-wing tendencies. So to give you a little bit of drama for like during the even before the elections, to be honest. And that's what another reason why people were very, very angry at Macron for dissolving the assembly, because he knew that the left was really struggling at that point. There were two different tendencies within the left. The more moderate, we need to reconquer, even three different tendencies. You had like the center-left, Keir Starmer type of tendency, more like Democratic Party type of tendency. Then you have the Mélenchon tendency, more radical, but also with a big focus on trying to make people living in what we call the banlieue. So like the suburban areas around Paris, but like super close to Paris. So usually like more diverse population, low income, etc. So Mélenchon really tried to get those people to vote. And that's why he got the label of, being Islamo-leftists, all those like weird terms that were invented by opponents. That's where it comes from. So you had like those two tendencies, and then you had another tendency with someone called François Ruffin. Ruffin has emerged in the last few years. He was a journalist, then he turned to politics. He comes from the north of France, so he comes from super close to where I live, and same problem where I live, where I grew up, and same problem where we are dealing with the rise of the far right at a super duper rapid rate in places that used to vote for the left. So that's kind of like the dynamic in the north of France. And yeah, Ruffin embodied this sort of, we need to make sure that the working class keep voting for the left, and therefore we kind of like to leave on the side like all those, like be careful, like not be associated with like Islamo-leftism. Again, like I put like quotes and stuff. Obviously those terms don't really mean anything. It's more like conspiracy theory type of stuff, but whatever. So he embodied this sort of like, we need to represent the working class, like that. And what he meant is like the white working class. So there was a lot of division within the left before the elections, and it's still kind of happening right now where they don't really know what they should do in terms of strategy. Like, should we try to appeal to that white working class by adopting a different language, by maybe being less, putting the sort of trans issues, the wokeism, and like all those things are kind of on the side to avoid like triggering the white vote, the white voters? Or should we embrace that and not be afraid or resist the current racism, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of complicated, isn't it? And it's hard to come up with like a one strategy. So, but these are kind of like the debates in France at the moment within the left-wing party or coalition.
This is really interesting because I see a similar phenomenon occurring in a lot of countries, a lot of Western countries particularly. Like I hear this a lot from friends I know who live in Spain, and I hear this a lot, especially from Germany. I see it in Canada, and also being a dual citizen, very much see it in the United States, which is a sort of urban-rural divide, kind of being even more major than actually the working class bourgeois divide in terms of deciding one's politics. And by urban-rural divide, what goes with that, probably the biggest factor, it seems, is the people with degrees and people who don't. Now, this is something I think might change a little bit with France, I would guess, just because in France, isn't education, like higher education, free in France? Because in America, you have to pay a ton. It's very, it's a lot harder to do it. Just like quick question there before I go to the next part.
When I say that, like, education is free in France, then I get a bunch of like French people commenting, how dare you say this? It's much more complicated than that. Yes, it is. It's not free, obviously, but yeah, it's way more accessible than it is in the US, in the UK, or other countries where you to pay an actual fee. So yeah, in France, like you have support when you do your studies. It's mostly free. And so like just to quickly answer your question, the element of like, the divide between people who are educated, who go to college, and those who can't go to college or don't go to college is not as big of a deal now, even though we do see that divide in the votes. But it's not as bad as it is in the US, I would say.
Because a big contradiction I see on the fact that it does seem to be cross-cultural. It's not just like something American or something Canadian, and that it's occurring in these advanced capitalist Western countries. To some extent, it actually seems to be occurring in Mexico when I was learning about Mexico, except that the left kind of has the support of the workers. And, it's the kind of center-right that's stuck in a more managerial, educated bubble. Whereas I see actually a big problem with the left, it seems, in a lot of places, is that it's way too heavily led by what some people call, there's debates about this term, but like professional managerial class is a term people use a lot. And the issue with that, right, is people who are schooled in a certain set of progressive worldviews use a certain kind of language that, just doesn't resonate or just doesn't sound familiar to a lot of people who aren't schooled in that. So certain terms seem alienating. And I think, when people say, the white working class or whatever gets triggered by certain progressive issues, I think it's people think that means like inherently you can't talk about those issues, or that inherently they just don't like those issues. Whereas I think a lot of it has to do with the framing and wording. Like I notice it's a lot of progressive lingo that, you kind of, it's very, very all recent. A lot of it doesn't resonate with people outside of college because, they see it as, or not even outside of college, outside of the social sciences, honestly. Because I do notice actually even a STEM social science divide between people who, are for or opposed to quote unquote wokeism. I don't really like that term because it doesn't really mean anything like anymore. I thought I knew what it meant, but I feel like it shifts depending on the types of people using it. But I guess the general thing, it seems, is that a lot of it has to do with language. Like I think there's a lot of stuff that makes sense in theory, like intersectionality, like as like a theory to understand the dynamics of race, gender, and in a class. But when used on a mass level as like political signifiers, a lot of people kind of just, it's find it a little.
Mm.
I don't know. I don't know if is that like part of the debate, because kind of what I see is a lot of it. To me, it's not like whether we should go right wing on social issues or just go full on economics. For me, it's a lot of it's a language issue more than it is like whether you abandon some issues or not.
No, you definitely raised some important points there and things that we've noticed on the ground as well, like when we were doing the canvassing. And obviously, like you pick a different approach and you go way more in the direction of using effects. So, like connecting to a personal experience or maybe their personal experience of the person you're talking to. So that's like a big thing when you want to convince. It's like, I feel like it's a combination of different things. And obviously like all those, the fact that terms like, like feminism, trans rights, or the fact that they trigger such a strong emotional response for people on the right or far right is a problem in itself. How did we get to that point where just mentioning those terms like triggers such a strong emotional response? And I blame many people for this. I blame obviously like mainstream media for using theirs as like token for, engagement, whatever, like not really covering those issues in the proper way. And going more towards like the Twitter discourse route. So there's that. Obviously, the right weaponizing those terms, etc. And as well, like we have to say it, like the left sometimes using it in the wrong context. I don't think those words are problematic in itself. Or like we shouldn't use them, or we shouldn't talk about those things. I feel like that's the biggest problem at the moment within, like the sort of left-wing debate contradictions I was talking about. Is that some people feel like we should just not talk about those things at all, whereas I'm much more agree with you in the sense that I think it's sometimes just the framing, the context. We can bring those issues, those themes, etc., in a way that makes sense to the person we're talking to. So like, I don't want to be too harsh because obviously like, there's a whole system like trying to capitalize on.
You can be hard.
No, but like,
because
there's a whole system,
we're very critical of the left also on this show in terms of like
self.
Right.
Yeah, but I want to acknowledge that, all those terms, like they have a certain meaning, they have value. And the fact that they have become such a, like something we use, something that triggers so much emotions, etc. Like sometimes I'm like, like, how did we get there? And is it really the fault of the left's problem that those words have such like bad connotations and etc. And when it comes to, obviously for me, like feminism is something that is quite important to me. Like I wrote about it, I cover it on the channel quite frequently. And I feel like my fight to reclaim what feminism means to me and to a lot of people is more directed towards people who've misused it. Like, let's say, more center-left people, Democrats, if we, in the context of the US, who've used it as a sort of, girl boss, that's, all that rhetoric, like, feminism is about like earning a lot of money, but it's okay because you're women. It's about like holding so much power, but it's okay because you're women. It's about like going to war and like killing people, but it's okay because you're a woman. And it's like, I feel like my job, like as a feminist, is to is to make it impossible for those people to call those things feminism, So I feel like language is so important. And the fact that when you say feminism to the average person, what they see is that sort of girl boss, oh, she's annoying, like reclaiming power, oh, now come on, like they're trying to take over or whatever, like a gender war and everything. Like I want all those concepts to disappear and replace them with something that makes so much more sense for me. Like the idea of, yeah, feminism is about care, but like not care like in a gendered way. It's about like caring for everyone, that has social consequences. You can apply that in so many different ways. For me, feminism is about rehabilitative justice. So like looking at the person not as someone who's inherently bad and, all those things, but someone who can change, etc. Like these are the sort of things I want to associate with, and I want people to associate with feminism. So it's a war. It really is for language and like what those words mean at the moment. Like they trigger so much negative emotions. And I feel like there's something wrong. But I know that it's not just people on the left type of problem. It's also mainstream media. It's also how the right use them. And we're clearly losing at this war, but I'm optimistic. And I believe that, for a time, like there was this whole debate of like, should we kind of give up on those words and just like, not just stop using those words, talk about like humanity instead of women's rights and trans rights. But like, wouldn't that be us accepting that we've lost doing that, like just not using those words anymore? I feel like it would be, language is so important, and it has been so important in history to, when you have a word, you can convey like an entire byte, you can convey like so much, and having the words to I don't know, like, I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying, but it's like, oh, it's so important to me. And I'm just so frustrated. I feel like most of my work comes down to reclaiming the words that we've lost, like all those words that are so important, that cover so much pride, so much history, so much struggle, and are just being misused by people who are so careless about like all the history of those concepts. Like again, like feminism, the way Democrats will use it as a sort of, just any woman that's in power becomes a feminist. Like how can you disregard like the history of the movement, the struggle that women went through to forge that word, to forge that concept? How can you do that? So yeah, I'm going on a tangent there, but it's just something that is really dear to me. So I felt like I had to clarify my thoughts on this.
Certainly. And I think your wages for housework video kind of reframes
Exactly. Yeah.
certain issues that I think would actually appeal to a lot of people who might be critics of feminism, because there's a kind of like perception that I think is largely created by propaganda and depiction, but also kind of reinforced by some wings of the, I would say, some wings of the left, of the professional managerial class left, to kind of create this image that the left is like opposed to family itself, right? And not like reframing the roles in the family, or kind of redefining the family to be something less one-dimensional. I think there's this perception that, all leftists are advocating for everyone to be, cared for by communes, and to abolish the concept of parents altogether. And look, there's people who advocate that. So that's the thing where the lines do get kind of blurred. And those, which I would say is a minority of the left, gets kind of used by targets to smear the whole entire thing. And you mentioned earlier about like a lot of this depends on who you're talking to, right? Like as YouTubers, we might have specific audiences, and what we might want to say or target can work for targeting particular people. The tricky thing with politics, right, is that it's so mass level, and they have to target so many different people at once. And it then becomes more like you have to be more strategic, I think. And with mass politics, like if I was to advise a party, would be different from what I would do on my own channel, right? Like on a mass party, I think it only just mathematically makes sense to kind of prioritize, not so much like pick one issue and ignore the rest, or not talk about the rest, but kind of like at a level of priority in terms of like what is talked about more based on what affects the majority of the population. So like, I mean, what affects the majority of the population, stuff that kind of concerns the general nation. So that would be, I think class stuff, environmental stuff, economy stuff. Then I would, feminism already there is kind of pretty high on the list because it's half the population, right? Then you kind of go increasingly, then race, then you trans, right? And I think the trans stuff, it's like, it's not like that doesn't matter. Like, and it's not like, I think there's so much misinformation regarding that issue, like so much crazy stuff. But I mean, the fact that people are debating like whether trans people should be in Olympic sports as the topic instead of like, issues that affect way more people. I think, the right kind of succeeds on those culture wars, right? That's how they succeed. They take these very marginal issues and use that to distract. In Canada, I remember back Stephen Harper would use Islam heavily as like an issue. The niqab, should that be banned? And I think like the response to that isn't just to double down and go super hard on that culture issue, because that's where the right succeeds. They succeed by weaponizing the fact that like a lot of those issues don't affect a lot of people. And also there's a lot of lack of knowledge on those issues. So it's very easy to kind of drum up fear campaigns. So I think like, I don't know, my instinct is just the probably correct thing is to kind of reframe the issue and the debate around where your side is strongest. Like what issues does your side have way more support on? And I don't know, I feel like the left's strength has always been the fact that like, it's ahead of the curve when it comes to representing, the less wealthy parts of society and stuff that might negatively affect big business, like climate, right? If the big business has a interest in not seriously dealing with climate change, aside from maybe some small factions of it, right?
No, it's tough. I don't know if I have like, it's one of the topics where we can debate about it like for like hours. But like when it comes to having like solutions and what should we do, actually, it's always tough. The way I see it personally is to, first of all, like we have to acknowledge that as you said, like oftentimes like left-wing people are being trapped, like they mainstream media again, or like they create those traps where they will hyper focus on like specific topics. Oh, what do you think about trans rights and blah, blah. It's like, like that's not necessarily what the person came to talk about. And oftentimes they'll ask the question to the person in the party that is the least qualified to answer that sort of question. I think the right thing to do is to still show confidence, because like some people will say just dodge the question and go on to something else. Just go back to economics, go back to something that, as you said, like when you do like electoral politics, we have to always keep in mind like what is the context. If the context is electoral politics, then of course like we have to apply like strategies that are sometimes very disgusting, as long as the values are strong. And I feel like that's the basis that sometimes left-wing people will drop. They will drop like those essential values where it's like human dignity, more rights for more people, like we're all equal, fighting for equality. These are the basis. And so I feel like either the good thing to do would be either to assert them with confidence and ask the person to move on to something different, where it's like, no, we recognize that all humans are equal and we defend the rights of all humans. That's that sort of thing they bring back maybe to humanity, which is less triggering for some people. I hate the fact that we have to do those, like trying to, get our way out of like those very tricky situations, constructed builds by those mainstream media, trying to find those like clickbait stuff or whatever. Or the second thing is to choose the empathizing angle. So like just bring up the experience of not someone specifically, but for example, like just reminding people that, trans people, they exist everywhere, not just in city centers. It's not like a academia on the issue. Maybe your niece is trans and you don't know it. Maybe this or that person is trans and you don't know it. It's not like, because I feel like sometimes there's this, because we only talk about issues, like we're so disconnected from the people behind the trans issue, like just calling it a trans issue is kind of crazy. We're so disconnected from the people behind this very clickbait topic or whatever, that we forget that they exist everywhere. It's not just like an academia, trans people are not all concentrated in universities. Like they exist all over the world in society in general. So I guess empathy is the way to go with that sort of thing. But again, like we have to acknowledge that the framing of, again, like mainstream media or even on YouTube, like all the channels, like the Jubilee channels, etc. Like they do everything they can to get that clickbait element and to go onto those topics that are not minority topics, because they are like such huge things for the people concerned. But on an electoral politics level, you want to occupy this little time that you have with the thing that affects the most people. That's just like how the strategy works. So I feel like just acknowledging that basis of the values we share. We're not trading on those values. Let's move on to this topic I want to talk about, which might affect more people, stuff like that. I don't know. That's the way I kind of see it. So yeah.
Another way I see it also is like rhetoric and action don't necessarily have to be treated in the same way strategically. I mean, I think a lesson is how the right sometimes campaigns. The right does not highlight their least popular ideas. Like, for example, therefore cutting taxes on the rich. They will in the academic realm or in more other spaces, they'll try to say, here, trickle down economics. They will try to provide rationale and say why their idea is correct. But at the mass level, when they're trying to win votes, they're not going to say, we're going to cut taxes for the rich and we're going to cut your retirement pay. They're going to usually try to more focus attention around where they're popular or where they can easily just drum up some less even popularity, but opposition to the left or the center or whatever. They can kind of drum up attention to something that benefits them at the political level. That's kind of how I see it, because to me, Mexico is a very interesting case. Mexico, if you look at like what AMLO says, he comes off almost like a conservative. He was the president before Claudia Sheinbaum, and Sheinbaum's his appointed successor. He comes off almost like a grandpa conservative, even on sometimes environmental issues, because that's another thing. I think environmental issues I think the environment is the primary contradiction, even ahead of capitalism, I would say, even though they're directly connected, just because you can't really build socialism when everything is a disaster. It's going to be a lot harder. But I know a lot of the solutions with climate, I think, are actually unpopular. So like we have to be strategic with that too and how that's framed. But that doesn't mean like having in action, in policy, something that would abandon those issues. Quite the contrary. So like in Mexico, they actually passed quite progressive LGBT legislation. Same in Cuba. They did that as well. Cuba is a little different case because it's a little easier to pass legislation when you're the only party. But still, I mean, people voted on it, right? And the Congress voted on it. In Cuba and Mexico, I mean, they're far from like, they have conservative societies as well. In some ways, Mexico, some would say maybe even a little more with the Catholic roots. But they're able to do that. So, I mean, that's a lesson. You don't have to necessarily, not fight for rights. But at the same time, at the campaign level, there's a sort of, you have to meet people where they're at, right? We can't change everyone's mind overnight. That's going to be a slow process. And especially in an election, you have a short amount of time to get people to vote for you. You kind of have to go on where you're already strong. That's just my instinct there.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, I think it's important to, because for example, like when I look back on the person who won in my constituency or where I grew up, it was the far right guy who won. And he won not because he had the best policies, not because he was the most factually right, or he had like this program or this program, just because like he managed to collect a lot of pictures of him shaking hands with people. And I feel like that's probably the thing that not shocked me the most when we were doing the canvassing, but it's just because and you, and I guess like the people listening to us, we're so into politics that sometimes we feel like everyone is as like deep into it as we are. But like when we were chatting with the people, when we're doing the canvassing, most people like it feels like they could change their mind like this, like just see like one statement and it's like, oh no, actually I don't like that person. And it's always good to remind ourselves that politics like are super close to effects. And I think that's why as well, like center left parties are like becoming more and more unpopular because they don't have that effect element. Everything has to be like so rational. And so because of that, I feel like sometimes you'd think that with certain people, you have to use this or that angle to convince them. But I've seen it around me where I grew up, where just having someone in your family who comes out as gay, or someone in your family who, I'll give the example of someone I know who had this, because we had a lot of very intense discussions with during those elections, because obviously like being parents and children, etc. And I know someone who she went to her dad who votes for the far right. And she said, in your world, according to how we vote, in your world, I don't have a job as a queer person. Like my identity doesn't matter to you. I might be repressed. I might be not have the same opportunities in life. So I don't have a job. I don't have this and that. This is my life. under what you want, according to how you're going to vote. And that element, maybe that didn't change the vote of the person, but she said like she saw in her dad's eyes like how something shifted. So sometimes, yeah, and let's not be too rigid with like how to, I feel like it's a very like case by case situation. And that's why I always encourage people to talk to the people around them, friends, family. I know sometimes it's tough because you're faced with people like on a completely different level. We've been watching TV and like really, we have our French Fox News as well. So like it's the most popular channel in France. So, that is happening. So sometimes you enter conversations with someone who's like so deep into that sort of ideology and whatever that it can be tough. At the same time, like those personal conversations, there's that dialogue is so important, and that might change someone's outlook on, the impact of politics, like reconnecting politics to people. I feel like that's important as well, because my theory is that, I don't know, it's not just me, neoliberalism has brought so much violence. Like people now only view politics as violence. So the violence that they have received for decades, they just want to send it back to other people. And oftentimes the people below them, and they're encouraged by all those discourse that they see on TV, that they see from the far right, etc. Where it's like, we're not going to change your situation. Oh yeah, we said we're going to do this social measure or this social measure, but actually like we can't really do it. So we're not going to change much about your situation, but we're going to make sure that the people below you are even more bitter, like that we're going to push them even harder. So like you had that feeling that you elevate yourself, but deep down, like nothing changes. The status quo remains the status quo. And yeah, I mean, that's horrible when you think about it, that would motivate a vote, just like pushing down like those who are already below you. But I feel like that's the reality of things. So rebuilding that, focusing on the effect, on connecting, reconnecting, bring back the people behind politics, having those conversations with people we know. It's not useless, it's not unproductive. It's much more productive than, writing, making video essays. Like, I know that's very important what we're doing, but, like writing this long, like stuff on like Twitter, like multiple threads or whatever. It's much more effective to have those conversations with the people you know. And that's definitely something I've learned with those elections.
Yeah, I think at the personal level, for sure. Like at the personal level, and also just, in general, not in an election time. Most of what I say is advice more to people who'd run a political campaign, less so, just everyday lefties, like everyday people. And I wouldn't say to just only talk about class issues or whatever. It's more like at a political campaign level, because it's so snap. And you got at something important, which is that, a lot of people don't think about the nitty gritties of politics, and people aren't thinking about this policy or that policy. However, I do take the view that most people aren't smart. Most people aren't completely stupid either. I think there's a certain general common sense in which a lot of people, due to their lack of time and energy, they decide who they vote for in a very instinctual basis on a mixture of trust and economic interest. So economic interest in the sense that we'll see, like, just based on a very short impression, a very small amount of information, would this benefit my economic interests? And the second thing would be, do I trust this person? And like a lot of the time, I think people don't trust anybody because people lack trust in politicians. So it's really, who do I trust less? And I think a lot of that's just like the likability of an individual, because I think with Trump and Kamala Harris, I don't think a lot of people trust Trump, his voters. I don't think there's some, hardcore MAGA people, but a lot of swing voters, I think they just see it as, they see Kamala as even more dishonest as opposed to Trump necessarily being like the most down to earth guy. Right. But I mean, you look at who's able to talk on a podcast for multiple hours and who has, a scripted answer for everything. They're going to kind of trust the guy who just kind of bullshits off the top as opposed to someone with a script. And on economic interest, this is a thing I think gets overlooked. A lot of people, I've noticed, view immigration as an economic issue more than a cultural issue. And that's the kind of confusion and false consciousness, if you will, of the whole immigration thing is, it's not just xenophobia, although it often is, right? But it's kind of xenophobia as a product of a sort of displacement of like cause and effect, right? People will see immigrants as a threat to their job opportunities or a threat to, their wages. And I mean, that's not new. That's very old. In fact, like a lot of unions historically in Europe and America have had this kind of issue of opposing immigration on the basis that it would hurt workers' wages. I mean, a very extreme case would be Australia has had this issue even with its own native population. But yeah, the thing there is like, to redirect that, you have to kind of meet those needs, which is like the economic needs somewhere else, and also to be more trustworthy, to have like a kind of likable candidate. I think that those two things are so key, because like I think even those unpopular issues might be less unpopular if it was coming from a messenger that people trusted, right? If people like the messenger, that's so key to all of it. Because I think there's an easy way, and I see this a lot in reactions to the Trump victory, where people kind of think that voters don't care about policy at all, and they're just totally stupid and just completely racist. And I think they're missing a lot. They're missing a lot of the appeal of those candidates. And I mean, you said it yourself about Le Pen, right? Like, how does Le Pen win in socialist districts? That should be alarming. Like the fact that former socialists have gone far right, that should be a huge concern, right? So I don't know. That's kind of my 2 cents, if you will.
No. And that's also the reason why, like, I usually say that when I hear things, for example, like to reconnect to what we're saying, and then I'll go back to what you've just mentioned here with the language that we use. Sometimes I feel like even on some people on the left will say, oh no, don't use this term, like it's too technical, it's too whatever. But it's like, do you think those people are just dumb? Or like, like we can have conversations and use those terms and it's fine. Like they'll get it if it's like more personal. But again, like there's nuance in that conversation. But it's interesting how the elitist that sort of like is mitigating like how it is viewed in etc. used in those conversations. But to go back to the economics aspect of things, yeah, it's kind of tough. For example, like going back to the French elections, there was a very strong measure in the new Popular Front program, which was to raise significantly the minimum wage. And it's hard to measure if that was the reason why people voted for the left, but it's definitely something that they campaigned on. They tried to highlight on the media, even though like the media always tried to divert onto other things, the Islamo-leftism and stuff like that. But they really came back with it. So it's like, we're going to do this thing. We're going to remove the retirement reform. So no worries, you'll be able to retire sooner than what Macron wants you to. And also we're increasing the minimum wage. So there was those two key economic measures, which I think, yeah, like it was a good way for the left to kind of distance itself from the way it was depicted in the media, where it's like, yeah, we also have those economics measure. But again, like that gets weaponized in a sort of, but that's inconsiderate, going back to the deficit myth, all these things. Yeah, it's kind of hard to know, isn't it? I haven't looked too much into like more detailed studies of like the vote and what is the primary motivation, but what is actually the primary motivation, and like how we can look at what people say versus like how they vote. And if there are correlations, or in the country, if there are like, so that we can better understand like how the discourse is interpreted and like whatever, like, if it's coherent with the actual measures and stuff. I haven't looked too much into that. I've seen so many takes with the US elections, like some people saying, yes, that it's mostly like race and gender issue, or that it's mostly an economic issue, or it's just like the Democratic Party that is bad. I've seen here and there that Kamala Harris actually did better than Biden in certain areas. It's just that people voted more and more for Trump. So like the support for Trump in particular increased, but the support for Kamala also increased in certain places in comparison to what Biden did. So it's interesting, like, to take into account all these things, like why people vote, why do they go to is it just a person? Is it more than that? What is the difference between what they say and the votes? I guess like these are all questions that I'm struggling to have an answer to, because first of all, like I don't have access to all the data, haven't looked at all the data, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Like what would be I guess like you mentioned that economics plays a much bigger role than maybe would like to think, but it's kind of hard to know, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I don't know the data in France, but in America, the two most cited issues for Trump supporters, and as to why they voted the way they did, was inflation and immigration. And immigration is, I think, they see that as linked
Yeah.
to the. In the case of like Vance, especially, people really underestimated Vance because Vance, like, people, the left attacked him for his highly reactionary social views, right? But in the podcast, he rarely even talked about that stuff. In the podcast where he was trying to win popularity, he was mostly talking about like the average worker and how we're going to bring jobs back and how the left has forgotten its roots about the average worker. Right? He was sticking to those messages, and he was always linking explicitly immigration to wages. So, like, he did that in the Rogan podcast and the Theo Von and the Tim Dillon. And I don't know, like, so I feel like I understand the mentality of a lot of people who watch those shows because I did a lot of martial arts, and there's a kind of low information bro voter mentality. I like, if I were to put it as vaguely as possible. And the way they think about things is kind of very schizo. It's not like, oh, I'm right wing or left wing. A lot of these people don't see themselves that way. They see themselves as almost like either apolitical or libertarian. Everyone likes to say they're libertarian, right? Or they're like, oh, I'm okay. People can do whatever they want, but how is this gonna like change? And they go on instinct, like those two things, like the trust, right? The trust, or who you trust the least, and this sort of like instinct on economic policy, right? Yeah. And the thing I want to bring it back to France, though. I do also want to correct something because, like, yeah, people are throwing in these different numbers about the US election. Some are saying, oh, Kamala won, more support here or there. Overall, the Democrats overall lost 7 million voters. So, like, voter turnout was lower. And
over the entire country.
Yeah. So, for the overall, actually, Trump didn't gain much support. Like, Trump lost and like gained, but overall, he's like not much more popular than he was before. It's the Democrats lost so much popularity overall.
Okay.
So like that speaks, I think, to the Democrats like loss. I think I still hold the position. The Democrats lost a lot more than Trump won. I think Trump more than anything just picked up votes that he might have lost, because I think Trump supporters are more or either cult-like or a little short-lived, because Trump supporters, like a lot of them voted the first time out of a reaction to the Democrats. And some people, a lot of, especially under 30 men, voted who didn't vote before in this election. So there's a kind of almost new base of the Trump supporters. That's why I believe they chose Vance. So I think Vance is actually a more dangerous and powerful political leader than people estimate, because I think they see Vance as a sort of, I think he's like, he represents honestly like the kind of a lot of the same appeal of the whole manosphere, actually, like a lot of that stuff. But he dials down his most, I think, what is his most reactionary policies, like his super pro-life stances. He tends to kind of be low key about that when he's talking to mass.
Yeah, and so I even remember sorry. No, I'll let you finish. Yeah.
No, you can go on.
No, I was just thinking back on the comment he made as well with the, what was it, like the average gay guy vote? I don't know if you've seen that clip. I think it was on the Joe Rogan
we're going
podcast.
For the normal gay. Yeah, we were going for the normal vote. Yeah,
See, and the confidence with which he said that with, like, it's like, no, we're just like a mainstream party, which is exactly what you hear with the far right as well. It's like, as long as you don't make it a big deal, like, being gay is not like your entire identity or whatever. Like, if you're just a normal gay guy, like, why wouldn't you vote for the far right? Like, we're just a party like any other party. We have our strengths. We're gonna, in fact, protect. Because, I guess like the issue of gay rights, LGBTQ plus rights, etc., or even women's rights is just looked through the lens of safety, security, feeling safe. And I think like even like the more mainstream white feminists are also a little bit guilty of that, where sometimes it relies a bit too much on that. But it's definitely one aspect of feminism, like the idea of safety, like, sexual assault, sexual violence, feeling safe at all times, etc. Like, that's definitely a big feminist issue. But if you just focus too much on that, then like in France, for example, like recently in the past decade, a new group has emerged where they do similar posts to other mainstream feminist accounts where they'll like count the amount of times that a woman has been, attacked or even killed by her partner. But they'll do that just with people who are Black or Arab. So they'll just like focus on, they have that extra lens of, basically we just want to push for that anti-immigration, just like white supremacist message. So we're only going to cover the cases where it was a Black person, where it was an Arab person, just to show that, these people are like interestingly, like they're just bad or whatever. And so that's an interesting thing there. You see where it's like, we just focus on like safety stuff. It's like, oh no, all the rights have been acquired. We're all the same. We're equal on all levels. The only problem is safety. And who is the biggest threat to your safety? It's the Black people. It's, Arab people, like, all those things.
Yeah, I do want to bring it back to France quickly with
Yeah.
two things: is the divisions within the right, and also we're talking about economic policies. I don't think we got into enough about like Mélenchon's proposals, as well as some of the kind of talking points regarding what policies that they wanted to do to help the majority of people in France. Like, what were the economic policies that they most focus on in their platform?
Yeah, I mean,
I
like
only heard of tax. That's the only one I remember, but I didn't look
which one?
that
Which
deep.
one did you do?
I remember hearing about a huge tax on the rich, but I didn't hear much about the others.
Yeah, it comes back with every new like left-wing government or like left-wing candidate. It's like, oh yeah, we're gonna increase the tax on the rich. But again, like that's the promise, and then there's the moment where it's in parliament and people have to vote for it, and oftentimes like that's where all hopes die, and we just stick to the usual way of taxing. Yeah, like tax evasion is always like something that comes back with on the left-wing platform, even though like even like the far right now is quite big on this. It's like tax evasion. So they do like the both sides, tax evasion, but also like poor people welfare, people who rely on welfare and like abuse it, and they use it in a way that is so inconsiderate, and like, look at you, you're working, etc. Like you're going to work every single day, and you have to pay for those people who don't work and stuff. And again, oftentimes, like it's just the same thing as in the US with the welfare queens type of discourse. But they're still doing like the tax evasion thing as well. So they see it. They're always trying to be like on the social side of things as well with the tax evasion. So tax evasion is something that is quite big in left-wing, on the left-wing agenda. Again, like minimum wage, removing the retirement reform. These were the key measures. Also like with education, like, having more teachers, investing more into education. Just like the general, usual left-wing measures, something you would expect from like a left-wing candidate. Nothing too crazy. Again, like there was nothing groundbreaking, truly revolutionary. But because the media focused on like those little things that were considered very controversial, like the support for Palestine, for example, like that was really, really like on the media. Like every time they went on the media, they had to talk about like, oh, this person said this. This person of your party said this about Palestine. Or do you think like Israel has a right to exist? So that was probably the biggest frustration during the elections. Like, can we talk about the program, please? And can we talk about the lack of program on the other side? Like from the far right, from Macron, they don't have any program. There's nothing. Whereas the left made such a big commitment of having a super detailed program in a record amount of days. The program was validated by many economists, obviously like more left-wing economists, but still like they validated the program. So I think they are the party that made the most efforts in terms of proving that they're legitimate and that they can govern. But somehow on the media, they were presented as the party the least capable of governing, because they were too noisy, too like, not respectable enough and stuff like that. So that was kind of interesting, like the dichotomy between reality and like how things were presented in the media. But yeah.
Yeah, you said they were the party of the real, and the left kind of presented themselves as by talking about real concerns that affect people, as opposed to these, like as opposed to mere myth, like relying on these abstract myths that the right often relies on.
Yeah, but again, like that conversation of like the party of the real was not something that trickled down into debates, or it was more of how to think about the left and like how to, because there was a lot of talk about common sense. And even again, like the division within the left, like a section of the left, like the Ruffin left, so like the left that wants to reclaim working class support, he tried for a time to reclaim the idea of common sense. So he would create a sort of like left-wing common sense where it's like, no, it's common sense. Or like, it's not common sense that Bernard Arnault, like one of the richest person on earth, makes this amount of money in comparison to this worker. Like he would do all those calculations and stuff. And I feel like people found it interesting and that it did work in some ways, like sort of reclaiming common sense or left-wing common sense. But it didn't really translate in terms of votes. So it's kind of hard to know if it was a good strategy or not, because like deep down, this idea of common sense remained a bit of a, I'm not sure it serves the left-wing ideas, left-wing programs, generally speaking. So, yeah. But they were trying to do the sort of things.
What happened to Eric Zemmour? Because I remember just a few years, the right was really divided. There was like two far-right parties, Le Pen's party, the National Front, and I've kind of even more far-right party with Eric Zemmour. What happened to him? And is the right still divided?
So much drama with these people. It's like they always complain about the left being like so divided and everything, but god damn it, like they were so divided and like, so much drama. And like even the family drama, because like you have the niece who like left the far right, so like Marine Le Pen's far right, to go with Eric Zemmour, and that was a big betrayal because the family is like the Le Pen is like a dynasty. Like it's like the dad, the daughter, the auntie, the niece, like they're all involved in politics. So that was a big deal. Her kind of distancing herself from her auntie, Marine Le Pen. I think eventually she came back, but I'm not sure. But yeah, you're right. Like Eric Zemmour is like the right of the far right, but he better represents as I was saying earlier, like the south of France, that more like neo-Nazi, like upper middle class far right, which was it a new electorate for it better represents what the National Front or National Rally, as it is now called, what it used to be originally. So it was founded by Marine Le Pen's dad, Jean-Marie Le Pen. And Jean-Marie Le Pen was way more like that, like very neoliberal, like questioning the Holocaust, all those things. Or that was that neo-Nazi aspect that was very present at the beginning, that the far right has tried to, Marine Le Pen with the National Rally, that's what she also changed the name, like to sort of rebrand the whole movement and have a way more polished, this is the past, this is not us, well, we're not like that, we've changed, basically. But yeah, so I feel like that's why there was that new party with Eric Zemmour, who kind of embodied what the National Rally, the National Front used to be in the past. But it was funny because when he said that he was going to run for president, so like this is going back like a few years ago, because like he was so popular on Twitter, like he had a big community of, as you said, like younger, sometimes, educated young men, basically, who would be so supportive and super active on social media, especially Twitter, which is like their platform. It felt like Eric Zemmour was going to do well during the elections. And journalists who are all on Twitter also thought that he was going to do well. So there was a lot of coverage of like, oh my gosh, like he might like replace Marine Le Pen, like what's going on? Like people were generally stressed. Even Marine Le Pen at some point, she was kind of stressed. She was like, what's going on? Like, what is happening there? Like he's taking all that electorate from me. Like what's going on? And eventually like he didn't score. It wasn't that big of a deal. So it was just like a sort of social media phenomenon. It was not really like a real life thing. Marine Le Pen still managed to score a super high score during those elections, and people made fun of Eric Zemmour for bragging about like the score he was going to make, and eventually just like not having any support, to be honest. So yeah, but I guess like they want to appear as like a sort of keeping in check the far right to make sure that they stay there. But at the same time, like it's kind of bad because they embody the super far right, let's say. So they make Marine Le Pen look less far right, if that makes sense. So that's kind of like the problem for right now in French politics.
I have heard some people speculate as to why Macron appointed a far right prime minister. And I've heard some say that he was thinking that if the left had won and wasn't able to govern with a very divided coalition, you could have more instability, and also even, I've heard some say, threat of military coup, which is kind of leads me to a question of how much does the military support the far right, or if they're kind of more distanced from politics? Because I think that's always a overlooked question that one should look at, because you need to, historically, for any big change, the military to, at the very least, not hate you, at least not too much of it, right? You need to like, or unless you want to arm your whole population, Cultural Revolution style, but then good luck with that. But like, that's a pretty big important thing, right? Because like Allende, his government suffered a military coup that overthrew his socialist coalition brutally. Ask that also, and like I it doesn't seem like this is a huge, doesn't seem like it was a huge possibility. But the other aspect was, does Macron potentially gain from this by having the far right now kind of implicated by being part of the government, and they have a chance to, screw up? Like if they don't deliver results, they might lose popularity in the long term. And then Macron can come back in and say, see, I brought back stability, or I'm going to bring back stability and unify France.
Yeah, what you've just said there seems to be quite coherent with what Macron has done and said since he became president. He is someone who has a very, very strong ego. And I'm not saying this like we say this of all politicians, but in that case, like it's been quite a kind of scary at times, to be honest. He's causing a lot of instability, renouncing to all the little, like the hidden rules of Republican regimes around the world, where it's like you want to have that base of bipartisanship. You want to kind of, if there's a big movement, big social movements with demonstrations and stuff, you kind of want to answer that a little bit. He just bypassed like all those like hidden rules of democracy of the republic. So that is kind of scary. And I feel like what happened with the elections is kind of, just a prolongation of that. And I think you're right when you say that he sort of gave a chance to the far right without really giving them a chance, because the government of Barnier, so the current government, is very, very, very much on the right. The far right, actually, the National Rally, so Marine Le Pen's party, welcomed the fact that Barnier was going to be the prime minister. So they're very much on board with the government at the moment. I guess maybe they try to, but I feel like it's a failure, generally speaking, because they've become this sort of opposition movement, but not really, because they still oppose some of the social stuff. Where, so for example, as I just said, Barnier government is trying to completely change the way our social security system works. So like not reimbursing some drugs, medicine, and things like that. And the far right said, no, we're not going to support that. And in fact, we're willing to vote to dissolve not dissolve the parliament, but change. Maybe I said that earlier in the podcast. I'm sorry if I did. Not dissolve the parliament, but just, a motion of no confidence towards the government, so that Macron would have to recreate a completely new government. So, it's kind of
How recent was this?
This is just like a couple of days ago. It might have even been like yesterday or today. This is like really super duper new.
Yeah, can you clarify that for the audience? Yeah, can you clarify that for the audience? That's a kind of important detail, right? A pretty important development.
That since the election and since the appointment of the new government by Emmanuel Macron, the Barnier government, there have been talk that there would be a motion of no confidence in parliament. People didn't really know if it was going to come from the left or if it was going to come from the National Rally, so Marine Le Pen's party. It wasn't really sure, and apparently the left is just they're gonna launch a vote for a motion of no confidence, and the far right apparently said that they would vote with the left on this. But what they did say as well is that they're gonna produce their own motion of no confidence. So there is a consensus in parliament at the moment that they want to get rid of the current government right after they announced that they would completely change the social security system. So an opposition to that potential measure that will dismantle progressively the social security system is seen as a left-wing thing. Like it's a pro-social thing. So like if the left and the far right vote for that text, that comes across as those two parties want to preserve the social security system. So that's a form of virtue signaling from the far right that they are, a pro-social party. Now, we'll see how it goes if they actually vote a text coming from the left. As I said earlier, the left will not vote a text coming from the far right, even if it's something that they agree with, because that's the principle. Cordon sanitaire, we do not vote anything that was created by the far right. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. But there is a lot of defiance. Nobody really agrees with the government. Like, it wasn't, and that's why a lot of people said it's just gonna create more instability. Why did you do that? Macron, why did you do that? I think the idea he had was, to have power over who was going to be there, but also kind of please the far right, because obviously the Barnier government has a lot of common aspects with the far right. But at the same time, still have control what is happening and kind of trust the prime minister, I guess. But yeah, it's not what you're supposed to do in a democracy. You're supposed to look at the elections, understand that, because I feel like something we haven't mentioned is that Macron's party lost quite seriously the elections. Like they've lost. And to be honest, they kind of bragged that they got this amount of seats, but they got some seats thanks to the Republican front. So this idea, this coalition that parties from the right to the left made to make sure that the far right wouldn't get in power, they won a lot of seats thanks to that. So, for example, I personally, in my constituency, I didn't even vote for. I did the strategy of the Republican front, and I didn't even vote for a left-wing candidate or a Macron candidate. I voted for the right, actually. It was the first time in my life that I voted for a right-wing candidate because that was the strategy. So a lot of Macron candidates, I say Macron candidates, it's easier, but like Renaissance,
You mean when you say right, to clarify, you mean like center-right, like part of Macron's side of things?
Yeah, but in my case, in my constituency, it was very much the right. So it was like a Republican, if we speak in terms of US parties. So I voted for for a Republican just to prevent the far right from winning, and they ended up winning actually. Yeah, the north of France is it's tough. It's a bit of a struggle. But yeah, a lot of left-wing people voted for Macron's party, so you're right, center-right, a center-right party, because once again the strategy was the Republican front. So it's we vote for everyone except the far right, and let's go with it. And it's quite interesting to look at it in the context of the US elections as well, where there was a lot of discussions as well. Should you vote for the Democrats? Strategically speaking, what is the best thing to do? Should you vote for a Democrat, even if you don't agree with all the things that they've done and what's been happening with Palestine, etc., the arms sales and stuff? Or should you just punish them and not vote for them and vote for a third candidate? Strategically speaking, what is the best thing to do? In France, we were very, very clear. It's no, Republican front. We do everything we can to not have a far-right candidate in power. In the US, it was a bit different. And I know the situation is not exactly the same, so I don't want to make too strong comparison. But still, I feel like there's some things to compare there.
Any predictions for where this all might go? It seems a lot seems to be developing. I really hope that there's not a entire regime change by the time this episode is out.
It's hard to know, to what lengths the far right would go if they come to power. I think my pessimistic self is going to speak, but I'm afraid that it might also be the realistic self, that the far right may win the last elections. They are in a good position to win. The recent elections that happened earlier this year were yet another occasion to build frustration, to create more and more frustration. A lot of people, especially people that the left is trying to get back, working class, anti-establishment, working class, I'd say, or just anti-establishment people in general, were very frustrated with the coalition that even the left did with Macron, with the right, because they were this is just proof that there is the establishment from the left to the right, and that the anti-establishment is the far right. You're just proving it to us now by doing this Republican front thing. So that was another element in the equation as well. So we'll see how this goes. I mean, at the same time, at the beginning of the parliamentary elections, I don't think anyone would have said that the left would win. And they did. They won. And we just had like 3 weeks, which is like such a short amount of time to campaign. So sometimes when I hear as well, like Kamala Harris, oh, she had such a short amount of time to do her campaign and everything. And sure, like it's not the same scale. But look at what we did in France. Like we only had 3 weeks and we went from losers to winners. So a lot of things can be done and we shouldn't underestimate like how motivated people are and when you give them the tools and like how powerful that can be, people's movements. So yeah, so there's the pessimistic, realistic self. The optimistic self is the thinking that we're just going to repeat what happened during the parliamentary elections and the left is going to be able to do something that no one expects. But yeah, that's kind of like how things are going to look like in the future.
In your video, you mentioned the role of alternative media in this, in like social media influencers on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. I'm a little curious if there's a French LeftTube or a French breadtube, as some people call it.
Yeah,
There's
there
somebody who
is.
subscribed to me actually called Bolshegeek,
Oh yeah,
or
yeah.
yeah, who
Yeah,
seems to
no,
be a French breadtuber of sorts.
exactly. Yeah, he's part of the network. We have, I guess, the biggest like left-wing content creator would be Usul, USUL. He's been around for quite some time now. Now he's working with an independent media that is growing super, super fast called Blasts. They cover a variety of topics. They have very journalistic angle. They make me think of maybe like not necessarily Democracy Now, the Young Turks, but I kind of compare them to them because they have this sort of journalistic ethos, you know. And then you have like the more commentary stuff with Daniel has, they're blowing up these two. So yeah, things are happening. Like we're trying to develop that network and it's growing quite fast, to be honest. But at the same time, like when you look at the other side, like they are growing super fast as well. So, and I feel like the scariest bit is that usually in the past, it feels like the left or like in the last decades, it felt like the left was very good at organizing. And that was something that our strength. And we started doing during the elections because the networks were already there. So we were very efficient at organizing and that's how we got the victory. But now the right and the far right that trying to apply some of those things as well, like they're getting better and better at organizing. And that's where things get scary. But you see it in the US already, where in the past, you know, I'm thinking about Stephen Bannon, obviously, how, you know, he's used that sort of almost like activism language where you have to organize, like take back power, you know, like go in your communities and do what you can in your communities. Like this is also coming to France where the far right is starting to be more and more organized. I lost my train of thought. I can't remember where I was heading with this.
Well, if you remember what you wanted to say in the back room, you can bring it up there because now we're coming up on time for the public segment and about to transition to the back room segment, which you can get access to by becoming a patron for as low as $5. You know, that's instead of spending that on a Starbucks latte every day, you know, you can boycott Starbucks and instead
boycott, exactly.
And instead, you know, you can use that for just 1 month, you know, to get access to a whole catalog of exclusive content. You get at least, you know, I think like 45, 46 exclusive episodes at this point. And yeah, we're going to talk in the back room about a bunch of stuff, you know, some stuff related to France, but also I think more personal stuff related to content creation, because I'm kind of curious what it's been like as a left YouTuber in your kind of own political journey. Oh, I'm always interested in that when it comes to left-wing content creators. But yeah, Alice Cappelle. Anything else you want to plug?
I don't know. Well, I guess like I would advise that you check the videos, what I do. But yeah, no, that was interesting. I don't think I need to add anything else. I've been talking so much. I've been yapping so much, as we say these days. So no, I think that's good.
Imagine being a streamer. I can never imagine.
Oh
I
my
already
gosh.
find tired after doing these podcasts. I cannot imagine streaming 5 hours a day.
Yeah, with the feedback in real time. That's crazy.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you are an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.